and that the money is there, the pool of money is there. And I think we can do that in a number of ways. I'm definitely not in favor of privatizing this program. And something specific that we can do would be to lift the caps on investment. Right now we have a certain level of income, and if you make above that, you're still putting into the program the same amount as someone making, say, $100,000 if you're making $500,000, and that's inherently wrong. We need to have those people input into the program accordingly with what their salary is and what their wealth is, so that they're supporting the society as a whole. And rather than, I know there's been talk about increasing the age for Social Security, I don't think that's something we should be doing, but rather incentivize people that choose to work longer and help them that way.
The Republican tax plan is creating a squeeze where there's so little discretionary spending left because there's reductions in revenue and increases in expenses. These programs, we need to keep Social Security vital and strong and resist Republican attempts to gamble our seniors' future on the stock market. So I absolutely oppose privatization. And at some point, people need to contribute more who are able to contribute more. So I think that raising the caps is an easy way to help raise more revenue, to help make it more stable in the long term. Thank you.
First thing I want to make clear is that the Republicans call Medicare and Social Security entitlements. They're not. We pay for them. We pay for them throughout our entire life. They're not entitlements, number one. Number two, what they did with the tax bill was increase the national debt by $1.5 trillion, all to reward mostly wealthy corporations and billionaires and donors. And then three, what they've further done is they've increased the deficit, which this year will be, they say, $1 trillion. These are the facts that are putting pressure on our Social Security system. And I believe, like a lot of people believe, that this is a ploy to further reduce Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, but by creating this deficit hole that we're not going to be able to get out of. So the first thing I would do is repeal these tax breaks for these corporations, and I would make sure that the money that people pay into Medicare goes to Medicare. Thank you.
Just to clarify something, Senator Wexton and Dr. Higgins, you both said you wanted to lift the caps on Social Security. Are you saying lift them entirely or just raise the income level?
I would be open to looking at raising them, not lifting them entirely, but raising them commensurate with what on a gradual scale for what people are making. Likewise, I would like to explore raising those caps.
Okay. All right. Just as a historical note, the reason why Franklin Roosevelt had those caps is that he was afraid that if people paid in far more than what they would ever get back, then wealthy people would begin to view it as a form of welfare as opposed to something that they'd actually put into. And so if you run the risk, if you lift the caps too high or if you eliminate it entirely, that you run the risk that you've separated that link, and it could be, Social Security could be viewed as a welfare program. I need my glasses here. Otherwise I can't read a thing. All right, for this panel. There is increasing evidence that the Iranian government has used some of the funds it received from the relief of sanctions under the nuclear deal to arm its proxies in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon, and to further its regional ambitions. What should the United States do to counter Iran in the Middle East? And we'll start with Stoker.
Let me be very clear. Our greatest national security threat is Donald Trump. Our country is at our best when we are leading on issues like social justice and human rights. And that leadership, we need to ensure that we don't undermine the Iran deal. If we undermine the Iran deal, it puts us in a weaker position as we're trying to negotiate with North Korea and our world partners. We have to stay true to our commitments. We have to be the leader that we are as a country, both with diplomatic force, with morality, and with a strong military.
Thank you. It's a great question. One of the reasons I've been endorsed by the last two deputy directors of the CIA, the most senior woman ever to serve at the Department of Defense, Michelle Flournoy, and a number of retired admirals, generals, and ambassadors, some of whom were involved in actually negotiating the Iran nuclear deal. And I have lost friends because of Iranian activity in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And because of that, nobody feels more strongly than me that we should ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. And the single most important thing we can do to make sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon is to continue to maintain and enforce the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. So we need advocates in Congress who, when we see these terrible actions by the Iranian government, which there are willing to stand up and say, yes, we need to counter them, but not at the expense of letting Iran, again, move on the progress towards getting an Iranian nuclear weapon. Thank you.
I spent a number of years as a senior diplomat in the Obama State Department, working on representing America around the world. I have seen firsthand that the world is better and America is more secure when America leads. Iran is a human rights violator and a national security threat and cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. That means that we have to stay engaged, and we have a president right now who has two foreign policy answers, basically. Can I take my ball and go home, or figure out how to nuke the ball? Neither work around the world. I think we need to do three things. The first is we have to make sure that we are upholding the role of diplomacy here, and we're looking at a hollowed out State Department and continuing contradictions within the administration that not only isn't speaking with one voice, but isn't engaging. We have to uphold the Iran deal, and we have to hold Russia accountable, right? They interfered in our elections and remain a national security threat, and this president is not holding them to account.
So for this panel, starting with Senator Wexler, sanctions on Russia have mainly targeted members of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. Should broader sanctions, which would seek to undermine its economy, also be considered, even at the risk of hurting the broader population?
Russia interfered in our elections. That is undisputed by everyone except Donald Trump, and they need to be punished for that. That being said, it wasn't necessarily all the Russian people who did it. So sanctions need to be measured in order to achieve the result that we're looking for. The leaders need to be the ones who mostly feel the effects of these sanctions. But we also need to make sure that we put in place the protections to stop this sort of thing from happening again. There has been no movement on the part of the federal government to take steps to actively prevent this sort of thing from happening in the past. And we know they're going to do it. We know they've been doing it since they interfered in our elections in 2016. So any sanctions need to be specifically tailored to achieve the ends that they're looking for. I think that this first round of sanctions is a good first step. Let's see what it does and move on from there.
Donald Trump is not fully imposing the sanctions and fully enacting the sanctions that he has the authority to do on Russia. So that's the first thing I would do as a Congress. I would conduct appropriate oversight to make sure that the full breadth of sanctions and the full power of the sanctions are put in force, number one. Number two, Vladimir Putin will do whatever he thinks he can get away with. And this president is allowing him to get away with much more than he would have been allowed to get away with if he thought that there was a price to be paid for his actions. Number three, We're supposed to lead, and we are not leading in the world stage. Putting a fence up or a wall up around America and giving your finger to the rest of the world is not a way to lead. We need to build our State Department back up, which isn't going to happen with this president, and we need to engage in appropriate diplomacy throughout the world. We need to begin leading in this world again and not following. And the greatest risk, as we've said, to world peace right now is Donald Trump.
So you're right. The sanctions we have on Putin and his cronies right now are not doing very much, but I don't think that expanding them to the greater population in Russia is necessarily the answer, because for the most part, they have not been the ones taking place in attacking America and affecting our elections. So I think that we need to make sure our sanctions are fine-tuned to the people committing the crimes and causing the trouble here in our country. But more specifically, not only do we need a president that's not afraid to stand up to Russia, but we need a Congress that's not afraid to stand up to Russia either. And this includes Barbara Comstock. We don't see her coming out and saying that we need a stronger voice against Russia. We see none of the Republicans doing that. So 2018 and flipping the House, it will go a long way to affecting this.
All right, thank you. For this panel, the recent tax bill technically reduces revenue by $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years because lawmakers included all sorts of phase-outs, in particular repealing individual tax cuts starting in 2025. The tax writers were betting that Congress would be forced to extend the tax cuts. How would you cast your vote if you were in office at that time?
Thank you. The tax cut is one of the least patriotic bills that has crossed the desk of any president. It is. It is cynical. It undermines the future of our country. It erodes protections for Social Security. It opens ANWR for drilling. It adds subsidies at great cost to the American people in oil and gas. We don't need to vote specifically on whether or not to retain or repeal specific taxes in it. What we need to do is pass a new tax law entirely from scratch that doesn't allow the Republicans to put us in a box, that allows us to say we are going to pass a tax bill that is progressive, that works for all of America, that removes the subsidies on oil and gas that threaten our future, that makes sure that our industries are well taken care of and able to engage and compete on the world stage, but not doing it simply for shareholders and investors in those companies. It is time to reset and not play by their game. Thank you.
This tax bill was a horrible product, right? And I think it's reflected in the sunsets, right, that are only applicable to the tax cuts that hit the middle class and not applicable to the tax cuts that hit the special interests. It was a horrible product because of the process it went through. It was a horrible product because people didn't have an opportunity to read it. There were some good pieces in the tax bill that I think we need to be able to honor and keep, right? But it was a horrible bill, not because of what it didn't do, not because of what it did do for small businesses, but because of what it didn't do for workers and families. And for too long, Republicans have tried to craft a budget and priorities around only holding up business when we know investments in infrastructure and investments in education also help grow the economy. And we have got to build an inclusive, growing economy, and you cannot do that without workers and families.
I said at the beginning that it's one thing to talk about working families. It's another thing to champion them. It's entirely different to have lived in a way that these policies are devastating. I absolutely would not have voted for this tax bill. It raises taxes for 34 million Americans over the next 10 years. It cuts the SALT deductions that over 50% of our families right here in Virginia 10 have. It's on average a $13,000 deduction that families lose. This tax bill put large corporations in the center of our policymaking on the backs of middle-class working families. And I will always champion middle-class working families in Congress over large corporations.
Thank you. I don't think any of you quite answered whether or not you would allow the individual tax cuts to stay in place. I mean, it does bring down individual tax cuts to a relatively low level. It also reduces taxes for the wealthy and what have you. But for those, I mean, this is the game that they were trying to play, which was, push comes to shove, people in Congress are going to have to force to extend those tax cuts, even though it's hidden in the deficit, but it's going to add another $400 billion to deficit. So I'm just curious. You said you would scrap the tax plan entirely, but do you think that if you were faced that choice, would you extend the tax cuts, or would you not? That's my basic question. And you can just say yes or no. And don't go.
Well, no, when I served in the eastern border of Afghanistan, right, and you're sitting there with the village elders in a place where the Taliban are involved, and you're having a negotiation about the certain rules that they have put in place, right, that the game has been structured against you and against the villagers. Sometimes you just have to change the game. The Republicans have set a trap. Let's not fall into that trap. Let's go ahead and put legislation forward that removes the trap, that removes some of the fiscal impediments that are put in place, and fight for working class families. I think it's a false choice, and I think we can actually change the board rather than play by Republicans' games, because we've played by their games for too long, and that's why we keep losing. Thank you.
I actually agree. I think this reminds me of that parable of, having a dozen cookies and the corporations taking 11 and then saying, I can't believe that immigrant took your cookie. I mean, we're not going to make or break the budget based on the individual tax cuts that were set out. What we need to be looking at is the broader priorities reflected in this tax bill and how to address building inclusive growth going forward. And that is not a question that pertains to whether or not these individual tax cuts get extended or not.
I agree. This tax bill, for a family of 4 making $25,000 or less, it's a $60 tax cut. For a family of 4 making $3 million, it's a $180,000 tax cut. In the next 10 years, only the top 1% will be receiving a tax cut. This is a false choice. We have to ensure that we pass legislation that makes that more equitable and really champions middle-class working families, because it's been far too long that corporations are getting a ride for middle-class working families.
This side. Another provision of the new tax law is a $10,000 cap on state and personal property tax deductions. For most taxpayers, it is likely not an issue, but it will be a problem for upper middle class taxpayers in Northern Virginia. Would you support lifting the cap, even though most of the beneficiaries would be in the top 20% of taxpayers?
First of all, if you remember when Donald Trump was running for president, they asked him, why do you pay little or no taxes? And he said, that's because there's deductions that I take that allow me to. And the first thing I'm going to do when I pass a tax bill is to eliminate those deductions. Well, he didn't. He didn't. So a lot of these choices are sort of false choices, because they're putting us, as people have said, they're putting us in the context of answering to a really bad tax bill, where if we had Democrats in Congress who were leading the charge here, we could get a fair tax bill. I don't know if people remember, but in 1985, the last time they did real tax reform, they actually took away appropriate adjustments and deductions for the very wealthy. And they actually made the tax code about 1/3 the size of what it had been. So I'll say this, more than 50% of Northern Virginians use those use those SALT deductions, and they have to be reinstated in full. Thank you.
So this is a real issue here in Northern Virginia because we do have the wealthier, affluent community here, and so this is a real issue. And the idea of having caps on mortgage and property tax for certain, how much you make and how much it's worth, I think, again, is the wrong way to do it. I think we need to look at more of a sliding scale, percentages of income and things like that, to really be honest and truthful to everybody, to the working class and to the wealthy. And moreover, if we're going to get the tax revenue we need and not hurt the working class families, we need to make sure that we are taxing those wealthy individuals appropriately. Right now we're just looking at what they bring in on paper. We're hardly looking at what they bring in terms of capital gains investments and the completely untaxed derivatives market. There's $100 trillion there that we're not taxing. And so to say that the wealthiest people are taxed appropriately is completely false. And I think that we need to take a very close look at how we're doing it in this country.
The Republican tax plan, which gives the vast majority of the benefits to the vast minority of Americans, kind of reminds me of what Leona Helmsley used to say: only the little people pay taxes. Because Donald Trump doesn't pay taxes. Not that we would know. But you know who does? Who does pay taxes? The middle class. And in Virginia 10, we have more people, a higher proportion of households claiming the SALT deduction than in any other congressional district in the nation. And so this really directly impacts our people here. And these are middle class families who are benefiting from home ownership and who are taxed by their state and their locality to fund everything from schools to roads to everything else. So I would certainly vote to repeal the SALT deduction. I think it is something to repeal the cap on the SALT deduction. I think this is something that is a big issue for Virginia 10 constituents.
The Facebook Cambridge Analytica controversy have highlighted significant policy challenges related to the use of social media, such as the use of online political advertising, protecting people's privacy online, and countering the proliferation of bots and dissemination of misinformation. Would you support legislation such as the Honest Ads Act, sponsored by Senator Mark Warner and other lawmakers, that would regulate online political ads the way that political ads are regulated in print, TV, and radio? And should the Federal Election Commission amend its rules for disclaimers on online political communications, including advocacy and fundraising? We'll start with Ms. Friedman.
I haven't read that bill, so I would have to look at it more closely. But look, I think there are a number of problems with how we're dealing with news and information dissemination right now and how that's impacting our election. First, we have to look at Russia's interference and we have to hold them accountable. Second, we need fundamental, comprehensive campaign finance reform. It is absolutely true that each person's voice and facts are not being able to come through, and I think that's critical anywhere, but particularly in this district where Barbara Comstock's path to victory depends on voters not knowing her record. I have to say, on principle, I would support any initiative to make sure that campaign ads are more honest going forward, and that only would serve to get voters of Virginia's 10th better representation.
I too would be supportive. We need transparency to ensure that Russia isn't able to meddle in our democracy. They absolutely undermined our democracy in 2016. And if we don't do something about it, they will do it again this year. We have to have transparency on our social media platforms. We also too have to have transparency about the money in our politics. I am not taking any corporate PAC money. I'm not taking any Dominion money, and I'm not taking any NRA money, because I refuse to be beholden to any corporation or any group. The only people I will be beholden to are the people in this district, and in Congress I will fight for transparency to ensure that the power always stays with the people.
So the short answer is, yes, I would support making sure we have transparency in campaign finance ads, whatever platform they are on. And it is crazy that the FEC doesn't have the same mandates as television as it does on Facebook. So it's simple, we need to change it. But I further agree that Americans have grown deeply cynical about our politics. Too often, politicians like Barbara Comstock are serving the biggest donor instead of the biggest need. And it is time for a new generation of politicians who put country before party and service before self, who will change the way that business gets done in Washington. And that's why I was the first candidate in this race to pledge I would not take a dime of corporate PAC money. It distorts our system. People ask sometimes, are there real differences between candidates on the stage? And the answer is yes. There is a candidate who still hasn't refused to accept corporate PAC money, and in fact has accepted over the course of her career tens of thousands of dollars of corporate PAC money, including from the makers of Marlboro cigarettes, from Dominion, and from Big Coal. We need to fight back against those special interests in Congress and make a change. Thank you.
Okay, for this side, do you think online companies such as Facebook should be able to police themselves, or do you think the United States needs to adopt baseline privacy and data security standards? Would you, for example, support legislation that requires these online companies to disclose what personal information they gather and how they share and sell it? Give people the right to tell businesses what they can and cannot do with their data? Implement robust data security programs to protect personal information? And notify individuals when their personal information has been lost, stolen, or misused?
So simply yes to all of those. It's a long list. But I do want to acknowledge the slippery slope of privacy in the internet. I think in any legislation that we do, we have to keep that in mind. But by the same token, today, the internet and social media and things like that are not the novelty and the luxury that they used to be. They are part of our everyday life. We rely on them just like we rely on the television, how we used to rely on phone books and things like that. And so I think we do need to have a little bit greater regulation of what goes on there, not only in campaigns and making sure that ads are fully disclosed and disclaimers are there just like what we see on TV and in the literature we're mailing out to everyone during a campaign. But I think it's time that we do take a closer look at what's happening on the internet. And I think what we saw happen in this last election was directly related to that. We had no regulation. Russia was able to come in and kind of wreak havoc, and we didn't even know what was happening at the time. So I would be in support of that.
Online privacy is something that we all deserve and should have. I would certainly favor all of those things that you asked about, telling them what they can and can't do with your data, whom they might sell it to. But even more than a disclosure, I think that consumers should be given the opportunity to opt out of having them sell their data or exchange their data or pass it off to the highest bidder. It's worth noting that the FCC and Congress have basically done away with net neutrality and have made it even more possible for internet service providers to mine your data, to sell it to the highest bidder, and to completely invade your privacy. So that's something that this administration has really taken a huge backward step in terms of what they've been doing, and Barbara Comstock has been right there as a willing accomplice.
Glenn, I would agree with all those pieces of legislation that you discussed about privacy and the internet affecting our privacy. I think the same rules should apply to the internet providers as apply when our credit card information is compromised by some sort of hacking to a company. I think we should get the same type of notice, and we should get the same type of help from the companies that we have been infiltrated from. The next thing I would say is, as it relates to our hacking of in the use of our internet by the Russians, I don't know if many of you saw this, but what Jim Comey said, and for all of the things he said, one of the things he said that was the most disturbing to me was that when he brought up the Russian infiltration of our elections, nobody in the meeting in the White House cared. And I think that this is one of the most important things that can impact our democracy. And I think if we have a Congress that stands up and does something, we'll all be much better off. Thank you.
For this side, what would be your approach to combating climate change? A cap-and-trade approach like the Waxman-Markey bill. B, a cap and dividend plan that adds in compensation for energy consumers. C, a revenue-neutral carbon tax. D, regulation that requires increased production of energy from renewable energy sources, known as a renewable portfolio standard. E, massive investment in new technologies. Or F, a combination of these ideas.
A through F, wow. Well, first of all,
School, right?
yes, that's right, that's right. First of all, happy Earth Day, everybody. I would say we've got to take a look at all of it. I mean, we're in a position right now that globally we have to be a leader on climate change. We have to do things like get back into the Paris Accord. The Trump administration has overturned over 60 environmental regulations. 60. We have to reverse that. We have to fully fund the EPA. We need to make sure Scott Pruitt has a different career in the future. We have to fully fund the climate change study. We have to fight the rollbacks of the methane regulations. And we have to invest in renewables. We have to invest in hydro and solar and wind. And we have to invest in workforce development so that as our changing economy moves forward into a renewable energy economy, that we have the workforce available for those good paying jobs.
So F. Because I forget A through E. When I left active duty, my wife and our boys, we drove from here, where we live in Virginia 10, all the way to Alaska to see the natural beauty that we had spent our entire adult lives defending. And I remember standing at Glacier National Park with my sons, holding their hands, thinking what a shame it would be when they stand here with their daughters and have to explain why it's called Glacier National Park because they've all melted. Climate change is not just a moral imperative to challenge, but is also critical to our national security. Whereas right now, rising seas, which are not some future phenomenon, but happening today, are eroding our infrastructure, both military and civilian, leading to massive hurricanes that we've seen already this year, and overseas exacerbating conflict, where we're seeing deaths in places like Niger, from places where American troops are deployed from Niger to Afghanistan, where those things may not have happened but for desertification and the impact it's having on societies today. It is a national security imperative, it is a moral imperative, and we need to have people who will go to Congress and take on the special interests like Dominion, like Big Coal, that have actually prevented us from addressing this critical need. Thank you.
I would answer G. G for good governance, global leadership, and great investments. First, on good governance, we need to get Scott Pruitt out. And, call me quaint, but I believe in clean water and clean air and science. And we need to staff the federal government with people who are backed by data and facts. On global leadership, we need to rejoin the Paris Agreement, uphold our commitment there, and honor America's word. And then on great investments, Virginia's 10th district is a remarkable congressional district, and We have some major national security infrastructure in this district, right? CIA, Dulles Airport, you know, and 70% of the world's internet traffic flowing through one county. All of that is dependent largely on one grid. We need to be investing in renewable energy, not only to power that grid, but to honor our national security and a number of other federal incentives for conservation easements in the western part of the district and a number of other things I'd love to talk to you about afterwards.
President Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was intended by President Obama to create a trading pact that would counter the rise of China. Now Trump has suggested that he wants back in, even though the other 11 nations have removed the pro-US concessions that were made during the original negotiations. If the US could get back into the TPP on the terms originally negotiated, would you support that? And if not, why not?
This is, of course, another example of the Trump foreign policy, the Trump trade policy of America first, and America just ends up getting left behind. The Obama administration had worked hard to extract concessions and to get as good a trade deal as we possibly could, and meanwhile, Trump takes us out, and we end up in a situation where the rest of the world is moving on without us. So in the unlikely event that we could get back the pro-US concessions, it's certainly something that we need to explore. We need to open up more markets for US goods and help our exports and our trade in balance and counter China's growth as an export.
China is eating our lunch around the world right now. And they're doing it because we're allowing them to do that. Donald Trump is allowing them to do that. They are effectively taking over many economic opportunities in Africa. But what those opportunities also take over is and introduce is a corrupt element, bribery, and all types of corruption that is influencing both Africa and the way people look at the economy and the way people deal with the United States. It is imperative that we get back into the TPP and that we do it so that we can operate on a level playing field with China and take back for our own economy and for our own country and national security the important non-corrupt aspects of our U.S. businesses. Thank you.
Just like the Paris Climate Accord that we were just talking about for climate change, I think this is another program that we need to get back into. We have worked globally with our neighbors to make a better place, not only in trade, but in the climate. And so I think regardless of what Donald Trump has done, we've got to get back into this agreement. Because what we're seeing now under Donald Trump is potentially a trade war with China, which is possibly the most dangerous thing we could get into. They hold such a large portion of our national debt that if they called us on it, this country would be in quite a lot of trouble and reduce our standing in the global economy. And the way that Donald Trump is going about handing out tariffs to everybody, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. We need to be very careful with our tariffs. We can't be levying the same kind of taxes against a country like China that has very poor human rights experiences versus a country like Canada, who has a very good record in that. And so this one-size-fits-all thing with tariffs is also going to send us off the cliff into not a very good way.
For this side, despite the rash, Mr. Helmer, despite the rash of mass shootings in the United States, it's unclear that many of the proposed gun restriction laws would have actually prevented such attacks. The previous assault weapons ban was riddled with loopholes, so it was easily circumvented by gun manufacturers. Even if a tough assault weapons ban was enacted, there were already more than 5 million AR-type rifles in circulation in the United States, ownership of which would presumably be grandfathered under the law. So I'm going to just turn the question a little differently. What would you propose to reduce gun violence that does not involve changing gun laws?
So this is a deeply personal issue to me. I remember the first time I lost a friend to a bullet. It's a West Point classmate of mine. He was killed in Iraq in 2004, and I was devastated. But I also knew that we had signed up for this. But the kids in Parkland and Virginia Tech, they didn't sign up for a war zone in their classrooms. So it is time that the single most important thing we can do besides change the laws is change the seats of those who refuse to put laws in place that will actually constrain the gun law. There are those on this stage who, when push comes to shove, voted for the NRA's #1 priority, reciprocal concealed carry. Barbara Comstock has taken more money from the NRA than all but 10 people in Congress. It is time to get rid of those who refuse and don't have the courage to stand up to the gun lobby, and then we can get the laws we need to keep our kids safe. Thank you.
I debate the premise of the question, and as the fact checker, I think we have seen violence by assault weapons go up since the assault weapons ban was let to expire. If you poll the majority of people who say that what they really want to see is good gun laws that are already on the books enforced, they also think that our gun laws are much better than they actually are. They think we already have an assault weapon ban in place, and they think we already have universal background checks. We don't, and we need them, and that will make people safer. But to your question, I think the single most important thing we can do to help protect people from gun violence is campaign finance reform. Barbara Comstock was a top 10 recipient of NRA financing and has voted with them 100% of the time. I won't take any corporate PAC money. I don't take money from Dominion. And one of my priorities when I get to Congress will be earning that F from the NRA.
Well, I don't think there's any other way but to change the policy. And if our leaders in Washington don't change the policy, then we need to change our leaders in Washington. I'm proud to be a candidate of distinction from Moms Demand Action and endorsed by the Pride Fund to end gun violence. Because the idea that this issue is too complicated for Washington to act upon is absolutely outrageous. Outrageous. Our children are being murdered in our schools, and our country is failing them. I think we have to have a background check, universal background checks. I believe that if you're too dangerous to board an airplane, you should be too dangerous to walk into a gun store and buy a gun. I believe that the weapons our soldiers use on the streets of Baghdad should never be used in the streets of our community. We have a gun epidemic in this country, and we have to elect leaders that will do something about it.
I've noticed this is the second time Mr. Helmer has called out a candidate on the stage without mentioning their name. And I wasn't going to do a gun question on this side, but I think I'll just continue the same question for this panel in case there's someone that wants to talk about a vote they want to do.
Okay. First of all, I too agree that the premise of the question is something I think is false. I think that and not a fact. The reduction of assault weapons is proven to reduce gun crimes. When we had the assault weapons ban, when it was ended, manufacturers started making 3 times the assault weapons they had made before, and the one thing that absolutely went up was the number of killings and mass shootings. They increased by 3. So I believe that an assault weapons ban is essential. I believe that we can, number 2, the most important thing we can do to prevent gun violence, I believe, other than an assault weapons ban, is a red flag statute. Because a red flag statute takes away the gun from the person who poses a danger to himself and others. And in the states that have enacted red flag statutes, they have decreased domestic violent murders by close to 50%. So I believe red flag statutes are absolutely important. There's one pending in Congress right now, and if I was there, it would get passed tomorrow.
So I actually have an answer to your question. So this is my solution is not to change the gun laws, but to change an appropriations bill, and that was the one that was passed in 1992, 1996, whereby the Dickey Amendment was added to an appropriations bill, and the Dickey Amendment says that the CDC, whose mission it is to do this kind of research, to determine what the trend of automobile crashes is, what the trend of heart disease is, and what the true cause of gun violence is in this country. And so I believe the answer to your question is that we allow the CDC to do gun violence research. We repeal the Dickey Amendment. And to go hand in hand with that, we can't just say that they can do it. We have to give them the money to do it too. We have to give them the funding to do the gun violence research. Because of all the things that we've talked about on stage, I agree and I support with all of these measures. But again, with so many things that we do in this country, it's a Band-Aid fix. It's a fix to a specific thing, but we're not getting to the root cause of why our country has this unique problem of gun violence that other countries don't have.
Glenn, I also question your premise because guns are a necessary part of gun violence. So without guns, you wouldn't have gun violence. I don't see how, I don't think that those things are necessarily exclusive. I am the one candidate on this stage who has actually been in elected office. And I can tell you that in my entire tenure in the General Assembly, I have never accepted a dime from the gun lobby. And what I have accepted from them gladly is a failing grade every single year I've been there. I have patroned and championed legislation to institute universal background checks in Virginia, to close the gun show loophole, red flag laws, banning bump stocks, banning high capacity magazines. And yes, I supported Governor McAuliffe's bipartisan compromise legislation in 2016. And what did we get for that? We got a felony, Kathleen Murphy's bill. It is now a felony for anybody subject to a protective order to own a firearm. Over 70 people have been prosecuted under that section now, so we know there's a need for it. We also took one step closer to closing the gun show loophole. There is now a state trooper at every single gun show conducting background checks, way more every year, and it's going to keep people safer.
I'm sorry, State Senator Wexton, more than 60 gun safety groups signed an open letter saying it was a bad bill, that it made us less safe. And today, in Virginia, you can walk into a gun show right into our district and buy an assault rifle without a background check. That's the truth. It was a bad deal. It was bad for Virginia, and it is the #1 priority of the NRA in Congress right now. Barbara Comstock has co-sponsored essentially an equivalent reciprocal concealed carry bill at the national level, and it is the NRA's #1 priority to pass it. We need to fight back against that. Thank you.
I do not support nationwide concealed carry, and I would remind everybody that this is what you do when you govern. You compromise and you make decisions based upon what you can do. So does everybody get 100% of what they wanted? No, but domestic violence, victims of domestic violence are more safe now than they were before this law went into effect, and I respect the data. Victims of domestic violence are those most in danger from firearm violence from the people who would do them harm. And that was a good law, and I'm glad that it's on the books.
Look, I don't want to get into the bickering, but this is an important issue. Concealed carry reciprocity. What this vote did, and you can explain it every which way to Sunday, it added guns to the streets here in Virginia. It added guns. It opened the door to a national concealed carry reciprocity that just passed the House in December, that Barbara Comstock supported and voted for. We have to be ensuring that we are supporting legislation that keeps our kids safe in school, that reduces homicides and suicides. Concealed carry reciprocity is reckless and it shows bad judgment.
Let's switch gears here. For this panel, Nancy Pelosi has been the Democratic leader in the House for 17 years. If you were elected to Congress, would you support her to continue as leader, which would make her the Speaker again if the Democrats regain control?
Lucky me. Look, I think the only reason we're having this conversation right now is because Republicans and Barbara Comstock are trying to divide us. Right? When I am on the doors and knocking on the doors, people are talking about traffic. I just rode in, I've been commuting in with constituents in the 8th End, and I just rode in with a civil servant who gets up at 4:45 every morning because he can't afford to commute into work. And then waits outside the Social Security Administration building for a half an hour because the building isn't open yet. I'm talking to people about, their health care and the promise Barbara Comstock made to them to protect it. I don't know who is going to be up for election next year, and I will look and evaluate them based on their platform and how they're going to serve Virginia's 10th district, but I don't think this is the conversation we should be having right now.
I agree. I have great respect for Nancy Pelosi, both personally and professionally. When I was the chief of staff on Capitol Hill, I was a new mother. And there was a group of new mothers that would get to the Rayburn House Office building 2 hours before the start of our workday, so we could park in the deep corners of the parking garage and go to our cars every 3 hours to nurse, because there was no place on Capitol Hill for us to nurse. Nancy Pelosi found out about it, and the very next day, we had nursing rooms in the Capitol. I do think that as a party, we have to have a leadership that people can look up to and can be inspired by. And I don't know yet who's running for Speaker, but I will vote for whoever inspires the youth of our country and our party as we move forward.
So I echo the sentiments of my colleagues on this stage. Nancy Pelosi has done simply amazing things for our country and for our party. And it's true, she has done more than any previous speaker to fight for the rights of women in this country. Without Nancy Pelosi's leadership, we would not have the ACA today, which is a major improvement on what we had before. And yet, there is something deeply wrong with our politics, and Americans all over feel it. And the consequence of that was that so many of them were willing to vote for a guy like Donald Trump. And in order to change that, in order to take an issue off the table for Republicans that they have used so effectively to divide us, let's say this: it is time for a new generation of leadership in Congress that'll move the way to make sure that we are fighting for progressive values, that make sure we are standing up for what we believe in as a country, and that inspires America once again. And that's what I'm going to fight for when I have my vote for Speaker. Thank you.
For this panel, do you support or oppose fracking, new natural gas pipelines, or any new fossil fuel infrastructure?
No. So I mean, no to all of those. No to fracking, no to pipelines, no to new uses of fossil fuel. I think what we need to be doing 100% is moving forward with renewable energy sources, and if we're continuing to put pipelines, particularly through Virginia, we're only giving reason to why we should continue to have fossil fuels. As a scientist, I accept, not believe, all of those other scientists that say climate change is real and we are a part of it as humans. And so I think that we need to move forward in research with renewable energies and also with jobs. I think here in VA10 we can be a leader in the renewable energy industry. When I look out at Winchester, when we're out in that portion of the district, there's many rundown, closed factories, and I don't see them as a blight on the community, but I see them as an opportunity for a solar manufacturing plant. And that kind of job, that kind of industry brings many types of jobs to the area, all the way from the engineers needed to develop the technology, to the manufacturers of the panels, down to the sales associates getting out into the community. So I think what we need to be doing is moving forward with renewable energy.
Why we would double down on fossil fuels is beyond me. I want leaders who are looking for the next 20, 50 years down the line. And fossil fuels should be a thing of the past. So during my time in the state Senate, I have worked very hard to increase access to solar. I've sponsored a bill that would allow people to have community solar on their rooftops in apartment buildings and in their communities and HOAs. And also wind development. These are the renewable energies of the future. We need to take it seriously that climate change is a problem. It's unique. Virginia is uniquely vulnerable with our coastline, and we need to make more investments in renewables, not double down on the energy of the past.
It's been said already, global warming is the greatest threat to our national security and to our grandchildren that exists out there today. All of those things that you mentioned, Glenn, will only increase our susceptibility to the threat of global warming. We need to expand our renewables. We need to expand our exposure to wind, our exposure to sun, and we need to increase all of that because it produces jobs. It produces good jobs, and it is the future of our energy consumption, and we need to make sure that Dominion understands that as well. Thank you.
There are approximately 690,000 people who have been approved for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, who were still active when President Trump terminated the program. Most Democrats support a path for citizenship for DACA recipients, but I would like to clarify the number you would accept. Would it be just the 690,000 who currently have DACA status, the 2 million who would qualify under proposals such as Grand Durban, or would it be the 3.6 million unauthorized immigrants who entered the United States before the age of 18, such as under the American Hope Act, co-sponsored by more than half of the House Democratic Caucus?
Well, let me be clear. We have to support our dreamers. We have to ensure that we renew DACA. It affects over 800,000 young people in our country who came to our country at no fault of their own and know no other home. We have to ensure that we reverse Trump's decision. It was a heartless decision that he made, and it was also a bad economic decision that he made. It will cost our country over $430 billion over the next 10 years if we don't reverse Trump's decision on DACA. I also think we need a clear path to citizenship, and we need one that doesn't change the goalposts on people, which is what this administration has been doing. And I also want to take the last 15 seconds to talk about the wall. I think the wall is outrageous. El Paso, Texas sits on the border of Texas and Mexico. It is one of the safest cities in our entire country. This wall has absolutely nothing to do with security. It is a symbol of hate, and we have no room in our country for a symbol of hate.
On active duty, I served side by side with soldiers with names like Rodriguez, like Ahmed. I sponsored 4 interpreters that I worked with in Afghanistan to come here on special immigrant visas, one of whom turned around, earned his citizenship by joining the U.S. Army, and received a Purple Heart in Afghanistan. Those are the kind of immigrants that we have in our country, and are worth fighting for. And right now, none of us who served a country that we thought was going to be in the business of deporting children. So if you came here as a child, you ought to be able to stay in this country. And let's go a step further, because that is not the only pernicious act on immigration that this administration has done. The Salvadoran community is the single largest Latino community in Northern Virginia, and the renunciation of TPS, temporary protected status, and I've talked very much with our Salvadoran community, our Salvadoran Chamber of Commerce, impacts so many people who have come here and spent 17 years in our country, have had children here, have had families here, have paid taxes. It's time to turn the tables and fight back so we have a robust and fair immigration system that welcomes us, keeps us competitive, and keeps us driving in the 21st century. Thank you.
There are a lot of reasons to run against Barbara Comstock, but if I were going to sum it up in a statement, it would be her wondering aloud why we can't track immigrants the way we track FedEx packages. As my 9-year-old said, "Mom, I think I understand. Is it because immigrants are people and FedEx packages are things?" To answer your question, I would support a path to citizenship for every DACA recipient, and I think we need to move forward with comprehensive immigration reform that enables a path to citizenship for all law-abiding immigrants. I also think it's important to mention now that this is part and parcel of a Comstock-backed Trump agenda to attack all immigrants. And we're not only talking about DACA and TPS, but the Muslim ban and the constant attacks on communities of color across this country that are vital to who we are. Thank you.
So President Trump has announced he's moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Previous presidents have held that back pending a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and in fact, the Palestinians have been so angry they have refused to negotiate. Should Congress try to reverse this decision? Should Congress try to reverse this decision? And if not, what should be done to bring the two sides back to the negotiating table? Start.
Send Jared over.
Trump's decision to move the capital to Jerusalem, to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, was based not on the best interests of stability in the region. It was based not on any sort of diplomatic mission or long-term planning. It was based on rewarding a couple of his friends and donors. Any path to peace, to a lasting peace in Israel and the Middle East, is going to require that something be done about Jerusalem. And the U.S. decision to move the capital there, to move the embassy there, is only going to inflame tensions in the region. This is something that is another example of Donald Trump coming in and throwing gasoline on a smoldering fire. This is not something that is going to be helping us, and it creates further instability in the region. We need to be working together with our partners in the Middle East to fix this problem.
The problem with Donald Trump in diplomacy is that he doesn't do his homework, and he refuses to have the attention span necessary to fix problems around the world. What we need to have is a diplomatic solution, and I believe personally in the two-state solution, which is necessary to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli problems. I think that we need to spend some time with that. I think that moving the capital into Jerusalem is anti that, and I believe that we need to start. That's where all of the Middle East problems generate from how we deal and handle Jerusalem. And we need to spend a lot of time and do our homework and fix the problem in a way that includes thought, passion, and deliberation, something Donald Trump hasn't shown any proclivity for. Thank you.
Jerusalem is such an important city for so many ethnic groups and religious groups. And so for Donald Trump to unilaterally move our embassy into Jerusalem was absolutely the wrong thing to do. I agree that we need to take great care when we're dealing with the city, and I too would be in support of having the two-state solution so that we're recognizing Israel and the Palestine. I think that's what will bring the greatest peace to the region, and we as the global leaders need to have our careful and thoughtful discussions with our partners in the Middle East to make sure that we're on a path to peace, because that area is so fraught with tension that we need to, rather than ramping it up, we need to be the ones to bringing it down.
All right. This is the moment where you all get an opportunity to answer a question you weren't asked. So we'll start from that.
I think you've asked us just about everything.
There was something on that side that you wanted to felt you really was.
Sure. You know, one of the things that is important to me is making sure that we have representatives in Congress who are going to be ready to stand up and fight. That when we talk about national security, we're not just talking about the Department of Defense, but we're talking about funding our diplomacy overseas. And right now, in the last couple of weeks, thank you, Ambassador. In the last 2 weeks, we have seen a president launch missiles into Syria without congressional authorization. It was the intention of our founders that Congress has the ability to decide whether or not to make war. And yet our Congress, for almost a generation, has lacked the courage to stand up and say, lead with diplomacy. You, Mr. President, come to us and tell us that you want to go to war. Explain why you're going to do it. It's time to have folks in Congress who will stand up. And at a time where we have fewer veterans in Congress than at any point in the history of our republic, it is time to have people who have seen the consequences of war overseas who will stand up and say, when is enough enough? Let's lead with diplomacy. Let's make sure we're protecting ourselves and exhausting all other measures before we're putting soldiers into combat. Thank you.
I want to take this time to tell you a little bit more about me and the background that I bring to this race. I started off working in nonprofits, advancing voting rights and preserving an independent judiciary after witnessing huge voter suppression and meeting a woman who had a doctor invited into her, a doctor invite a pharmaceutical drug sales rep into her breast exam with no medical reason for being there, and having a judge rule that there's no expectation of privacy in a doctor's office. I helped keep that judge off the federal bench, and then joined the federal government at the beginning of the Obama administration, where I helped reform all federal procurement practices to help prevent human trafficking around the world. I bring deep federal experience and legislative experience to this race, and in a race where we know Barbara Comstock consistently goes up against and says, oh, you just don't understand how the federal government works. I do, and I've made it work better, and I think that's critically important.
I want to take this time to talk about education, because we haven't really talked about it tonight, and it is one of my top priorities. I was raised by a single mom who was a public school teacher. And we are in a situation now where our public schools, in fact, are under attack by Betsy DeVos. The Trump administration wants to cut the Department of Education by 10% right off the top, no questions asked. They want to cut important programs like Stafford loans for students, and they want to cut the work-study program by 50%. 50%. And when I was a young person trying to cobble the funds together to go to school, for me it was a combination of scholarships, the maximum amount of student loans, work-study, working 3 jobs, and a $1,000 check from my granddad. And had one of those pieces been missing for me, I probably wouldn't be sitting on this stage right now. We have to ensure that education is at the top of our national agenda. We have to ensure that we make college more affordable for families, fund community college programs, and apprenticeship programs so we can best prepare our workforce moving forward.
The question I would like to be asked is, Paul, what happened to accountability in our government? Thank you, Glenn. My answer is that, accountability is what democracy is all about. And Barbara Comstock hasn't been accountable to us, and she's not doing her constitutional duty in holding this president and his administration accountable for what they're doing to our country. And I think it's really sad that we're all sort of sitting there praying and hoping that Bob Mueller does the job that our Congress is supposed to do and that Barbara Comstock is supposed to do. And all I'm going to say is, it's too bad that we have to beg and plead to have 400 plus people like Bob Mueller in our government, because that's what we deserve, that's what we need, and I hope that's what I offer. Thank you.
So the topic I would have liked to have brought up would be the opioid crisis that's happening in this country right now. It's real, it's our next door neighbors, it's happening everywhere in this district and in this country, and I think we need to make sure that we are owning up to it and doing what we can to solve it and bring it to a resolution the best we can. And some of the things that I believe we can do as a nation would be to, and I've seen some progress on this front, is to get the pharmaceutical companies out of our doctors' offices. Right now we have pharmaceutical reps coming into our doctors' offices and providing them with free lunches and vacations because they've prescribed X number of their particular pills. That is not the correct way doctors should be prescribing medicine. And also, we need to take a closer look at the way we prescribe pain medicine. What is our culture? Should it be 30 pills? Should it be 10 pills? There are many other alternatives that don't involve the opioids. And I can't talk about the opioid crisis without talking about the mental health aspect and the addictive nature of opioids. And I think as a country, we need to work to reduce the stigma of mental health. We all know people, we all have it. And this is something that we need to make sure we're devoting the funds to so that it's no longer a stigma in this country.
One of the things about going last is that everybody chooses all the things you're going to talk about. So I would like to talk about things that I'd like to do for women. Because when I first got down to the General Assembly, there were very few women like me. There were very few women, period. There were no women, basically, with school-age children in the public schools. So I brought more of that perspective down there. Now, since then, I've been joined by a bunch of fantastic women, and a whole bunch more after the 2017 elections. Women made that happen. One of my first bills in the General Assembly was to give women in Virginia a right to breastfeed their children in a public place. Imagine that we needed that. But we need to make sure that women get equal pay for equal work, that we have paid family and medical leave, that we have access to affordable childcare so that women who do choose to have a career can afford to do that. And we need to extend the date for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment.
All right, it is now time for your 2 minutes of closing remarks. And I think we'll same order for the opening remarks. Yeah, so you start.
Oh, stand up.
You must all be ready to stand up too. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. You've been a wonderful moderator. We have amazing candidates here on the stage, don't we? And there are some real differences between us. I support a Medicare for all option, whereas other candidates have talked about expanding access to health care, but don't necessarily have a specific plan. I support, which we didn't talk about tonight, the impeachment of Donald Trump. Whereas we at least have one other candidate who said we need to adopt a wait-and-see approach. I think it is time to reject all corporate PAC money and have pledged not to ever do that. And yet we have a candidate who won't take that pledge and has taken tens of thousands of dollars over the course of her career from corporations. And I will never vote for a bill that liberalizes gun laws in this country, and yet we have a candidate who's voted to extend reciprocal concealed carry. It is time to have candidates who will fight the gun lobby and the NRA. So your selection matters in terms of the type of representative that you get, but it also matters for whether or not we can win in November. We have an amazing chance to flip a seat that's been held by Republicans for 2 generations. 2 generations. And yet, Barbara Comstock overperformed Donald Trump by 16 points in this district. And we have many candidates with similar profiles to those who have run and lost 5 times in a row to her in the past. And we saw in Pennsylvania that running on a record of military service can allow you to win, where my fellow Vote Vets candidate Connor Lamb won in a district that Trump carried by 20 points, we can do that right here in Virginia. And there's a reason that running on a record of service matters. It's because we all feel there's something deeply wrong with our politics. And I'm ready to go to Washington, be part of a new generation of leaders who put country before party, service before self, people before politics. I hope to earn your vote on June 12th. Thank you very much.
I believe in the genius and checks and balances that our framers understood that we might one day have an unfit tyrant in the White House, which we do. What they didn't count on was a Congress without the courage to hold him accountable. I am a first-time candidate. I stepped into this race because I believe we need new leadership and courage in Congress. And I also believe that I am our best chance to defeat a representative who is as excellent a campaigner as she is bad a representative. Here's why. I have extensive experience standing up to abuses of power and holding people accountable, taking on issues that others have written off as intractable, and making real change on the ground across the federal government and in the nonprofit sector. Also, and I hate this part, we know that we live in one of the most expensive districts to communicate in the entire country. And Barbara Comstock's path to victory depends on voters not knowing her record. I promise you that I will be a champion, and other than earning an F from the NRA, my other priority will be to enact campaign finance reform when I get to Congress. But in order to get there, we need to mount a campaign where voters understand what's at stake. And I am proud to have raised the most amount of money by a significant margin on this stage to be able to communicate that message and her failure to her constituents. Thank you.
Nice to see this half of the room. Thank you for being here today. We've got a lot of great candidates. In fact, anyone in this entire room would be better than the Congresswoman we currently have, right? We know how important this election is. Comstock has a 97% voting record with Donald Trump. She has taken over $137,000 from the NRA. She has sided and stood up for corporations over our communities. I never thought I'd run for office, but I think we're all doing things we never thought we'd do before. We're marching, we're knocking on doors, we're making phone calls, we're writing postcards because we know how important this election is. It's not only important to us because it's our home, but it's important to the entire country because there is no path for Democrats to take back the House in 2018 without coming through the streets of Virginia 10. I thank you for the opportunity to earn your trust, your confidence, and your vote. I come to this race with lived experience. I know what it's like to have less than $5,000 in my bank account. I know what it's like to work 3 minimum wage jobs and still struggle to pay the bills. I got a job when I was 14 to help my mom pay for our phone bill. We have to ensure that we put working families back in the center of our policy making. And I'm the only candidate in this race that has extensive federal legislative experience over 12 years. And at a time when we have a reckless president in the White House, we need a strong Congress and a strong check on this administration. And I can hit the ground running on day one and look forward to working with you to beat Barbara Comstock. Thank you.
Thank you. In order to take back America and restore democracy, we will need to start here in Virginia 10 and defeat Barbara Comstock. Certainly, we'll attack her on a pathetic record of supporting Trump 97% of the time, her NRA blood money, and her failure to hold Trump and his administration accountable as they continue to destroy our democracy. But we, as Democrats, will need to do more than to win in November. Our nominee will need to show they can fix what's broken in Congress, that they can rise above partisan politics and govern for everyone, that they can actually get things done for Northern Virginians. They cannot get cocky. The Democrat that can garner across-the-board votes in November is the one who will win, and I can do that. I've taken guns off the streets, and I know how to keep our kids safe in their schools and our communities by passing gun safety legislation that America wants and needs. I believe that every family should have access to the quality of health care, and I know how to actually lower health care costs and prescription drug prices. I can show that I will be able to work across the party lines to pass bipartisan infrastructure and transportation laws that not only improve the ability of Northern Virginians to get back and from work, but also create good-paying jobs. I will make our country safer by addressing global warming, by working to pass comprehensive immigration legislation that protects our borders and protects the rights of dreamers and provides a path to citizenship for law-abiding Americans. We need real tax reform, and I will work day and night to lowering taxes for all hard-working Northern Virginians. And finally, I believe to the core of my soul in accountability, democracy, and the rule of law. Every day for 27 years, I went to work and fought for those principles. I will do the same representing you in Congress, and I promise you 3 things. I'll tell you the truth, I'll fight for what's right, and I will never back down from making a difference in your lives. I've done that for 3 decades, and that's what public servants are supposed to do. Thank you.
I just want to thank Jennifer for organizing this great forum and Mr. Kessler for the excellent questions that you asked of us, whether we liked them or not. I think it's so important, here we are less than 2 months away from the primary, that you understand specifically where your candidate stands on these issues, not just in deeply personal stories, but the actual policies they will enact when elected to Congress in the fall. And so as I mentioned earlier, right now we are not governed by scientists, but you know, maybe it's time that we were. But not just scientists. I think that we need more women, more people of color, more members of the LGBTQ community. We need people that look like us, have experience like us, love like us. You know, I put forth that we need the diverse Congress similar to what we elected in Richmond in 2017. Barbara Comstock is a member of that professional political class, one that sits on the House Science and Technology Committee. Wouldn't that position better be served with an actual scientist than another Washington insider? I think so. And if we're going to win in 2018 in November, we need a candidate that can draw a sharp contrast against Barbara Comstock, not just in rhetoric, but in ideas and in background. So I put forth that we need a scientist. And we also need your help. In the next few weeks, you're coming up on the election, we need your help with knocking on the doors and getting the word out. I too am not taking any corporate PAC money. It's a grassroots organization. I will not be taking any NRA money, and I also look forward to receiving that F in Congress. And so I ask you to visit our website, give what you can, and my final ask of you today is when you cast your ballot on June 12th, is to consider nominating the first woman scientist to ever serve in the House. Thank you.
We do have a lot of impressive candidates in this race, so why me? Because I've showed I have what it takes to run and win challenging races in the district, and then to govern once I get there. I won both my races for the state senate in the heart of the district by over 10 points each, and I traditionally have outperformed other Democrats in the district. I have deep roots in Loudoun County and the surrounding areas. Down in Richmond, I have worked like hell to pass legislation that is helpful for my constituents and fought for our progressive values and fought back against the Republican agenda. This is exactly what I will do in Congress. And that's why I've been endorsed by our governor, Ralph Northam, by Congressman Jerry Connolly, by Congressman Donald McEachin, by all of the delegates and the senator who are here today, and Supervisor John Faust. It's because they know I have what it takes to win the election and then to govern once I get there. So I hope to earn your support, and I hope to earn your respect now and in Congress. Thank you.